Hello guys, welcome to my channel. My name is Miracle, Mimi for short. If this is the first time seeing my beautiful face, you're welcome. So our next video is from Sowell, and it said, don't be fooled. Reparations will never happen. 100%. It will never happen. So stop dreaming about it. Just stop dreaming about it. Wow. I just love the intellectual that Sowell have, his wisdom, the way he understands things, the way he breaks things for us to understand. It's just very real. He's really and indeed a national treasure. Let's check this video out.
Something moved in the California legislature calling for formal reparations to African Americans. How do you respond to that?
One, I know and they know it's not going to happen. So what we're looking at is someone who wants votes or followers, and that this will get them votes or get them followers and finances. But it's not, all it will do is simply tear the country apart.
What we see in the United States in terms of the bad things, you see all around the world. If you were to give reparations to everyone whose ancestors had been slaves, I suspect that you would have to give reparations to more than half the entire population of the globe. Slavery was not confined to one set of races. I suspect that most of the people who were either slaves or slave owners around the world were neither white nor black. I mean, this was a universal curse of the human species.
Africa, the Middle East, Asia, slavery took place everywhere.
And it continued elsewhere long after it was abolished in the Western countries. Right. The other thing, I have a slight sidebar in there on the history of slavery. Mm-hmm. The history of slavery existed all over the world for thousands of years among all sorts of people, as far back as the history of the human species goes. It's one of many evils that the left tries to localize, when in fact it is a universal evil. But more than that, as much as slavery is repudiated around the world today, prior to the 18th century, I know of no serious effort to abolish the institution anywhere. Anywhere.
Not in Africa, not in the Arabian world.
Not in Africa in the 21st century. When Adam Smith wrote in 1776 that the only place in the world where slavery had been abolished completely was Western Europe. And so this was
as late as the year this country was founded.
Yes. And so the idea that this is something that the United States had that nobody else had, or the other countries that didn't have, it's been estimated that there are more slaves in India than in the entire Western Hemisphere. And that's before and after Columbus got here.
Right.
There are various laws and policies that benefit one group at the expense of another. But I think affirmative action has the distinction of being one that it harms everybody, though in different ways. And so there's a lot of evidence that there are black kids who have all the qualifications to be successes in college, who nevertheless are failures because they are systematically mismatched with institutions whose standards they don't meet, even though they may meet the standards of 80 or 90% of the colleges in America. I remember first aware of this when I was teaching at Cornell, and I found that half the black students at Cornell were on some kind of academic probation. And so I went over to the administration building and looked up the SATs of these students. The average black student at Cornell at that time scored at the 75th percentile.
Which is pretty darn good.
Yes. And so that means that in most colleges in this country, they would have no trouble, and many of them would be on the dean's list. But at Cornell, the average liberal arts student at that time was in the 99th percentile. And when you're teaching the students like that, you teach at a pace that most people of any race cannot keep up with. And it was always complained that I was assigning all kinds of reading, but heck, I'm teaching kids who are in the top 1%. They can keep up with the reading that I'm assigning.
So Cornell was taking very talented black kids and spending 4 years teaching them to feel inadequate.
Yes, and succeeding at that. In terms of political leaders, all the incentives politically are for black leaders to blame all problems in the black community on the larger society. And that enables them to take on the role of being the defender of the black community against enemies, which in turn creates the situation in which many blacks don't feel that anything that they do is going to help themselves unless it's done politically as a group. That there's no point. I mean, why would you, if you believe what they say, why would you want to knock yourself out in school knowing that the man is not going to let you get anywhere? Well, one of the most pathetic things I heard in recent years was a young black man saying that, at one point he thought he would join the Air Force and become a pilot. And then he says he realized that the white man is not going to let a black man become a pilot. And he was saying this decades after the Tennessee Airmen had established their reputation in combat in Europe. But the hopelessness is one of the big products of the race industry. That you have no chance. I remember giving a talk at Marquette, and at the end of the talk, among the questions that was asked, a young black man got up and he said, "Even though I am graduating from Marquette, you equip yourself with skills that people are willing to pay for."
All right.
Nowhere have intellectuals seen racial issues as issues about intertemporal abstractions more so than in discussions of slavery. Moreover, few facts of history have been so distorted by highly selective filtering as has the history of slavery. To many people today, slavery means white people holding black people in bondage. The vast millions of people around the world who were neither white nor black, but who were either slaves or enslavers for centuries, fade out of this vision of slavery as if they had never existed, even though they may well have outnumbered both blacks and whites. It has been estimated that there were more slaves in India than in the entire Western Hemisphere. China, during the era of slavery, has been described as one of the largest and most comprehensive markets for the exchange of human beings in the world. Slaves were a majority of the population in some of the cities in Southeast Asia. At some period or other in history, as John Stuart Mill pointed out, almost every people now civilized have consisted, in majority, of slaves. When Abraham Lincoln said, "If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong," he was expressing an idea peculiar to Western civilization at that time, and by no means universally accepted throughout Western civilization. What seems almost incomprehensible today is that there was no serious challenge to the moral legitimacy of slavery prior to the 18th century. Christian monasteries in Europe and Buddhist monasteries in Asia both had slaves. Even Thomas More's fictional ideal society, Utopia, had slaves. Although intellectuals today may condemn slavery as a historic evil of our society, what was peculiar about Western society was not that it had slaves, like other societies around the world, but that it was the first civilization to turn against slavery, and that it spent more than a century destroying slavery, not only within Western civilization itself, but also in other countries around the world, over the often bitter and sometimes armed resistance of people in other societies. Only the overwhelming military power of Western nations during the age of imperialism made this possible. Slavery did not quietly die out of its own accord. It went down fighting to the bitter end in countries around the world, and it has still not totally died out to this day in parts of the Middle East and Africa. It is the image of racial slavery, white people enslaving black people, that has been indelibly burned into the consciousness of both black and white Americans today by the intelligentsia, and not simply as a fact about the past, but as a causal factor used to explain much of the present, and an enduring moral condemnation of the enslaving race. Yet two crucial facts have been filtered out of this picture. One, the institution of slavery was not based on race, and two, whites as well as blacks were enslaved. The very word slave is derived from the name of a European people, Slavs, who were enslaved for centuries before the first African was brought in bondage to the Western Hemisphere. It was not only in English that the word for slave derived from the word for Slav. The same was true in various other European languages and in Arabic. For most of the history of slavery, which covers most of the history of the human race, most slaves were not racially different from those who enslaved them. Not only did Europeans enslave other Europeans, Asians enslaved other Asians, Africans enslaved other Africans, Polynesians enslaved other Polynesians, and the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere enslaved other indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere. Moreover, after it became both technologically and economically feasible to transport masses of slaves from one continent to another, that is, to have a whole population of slaves of a different race, Europeans as well as Africans were enslaved and transported from their native lands to bondage on another continent. Pirates alone transported 1 million or more Europeans as slaves to the Barbary coast of North Africa, at least twice as many European slaves as there were African slaves transported to the United States and to the 13 colonies from which it was formed. Moreover, white slaves were still being bought and sold in the Islamic world decades after blacks had been freed in the United States. What marked the modern era of slavery in the West was the fact that, as distinguished historian Daniel Boorstin pointed out, now, for the first time in Western history, the status of slave coincided with the difference of race. But to claim that race or racism was the basis of slavery is to cite as a cause something that happened thousands of years after its supposed effect. As for the legacy of slavery in the world of today, that is something well worth investigating, as distinguished from simply making sweeping assumptions. Too many assumptions that have been made about the effects of slavery on both blacks and whites will not stand up under scrutiny. Back during the era of slavery in the United States, such prominent writers as the French visitor and observer Alexis de Tocqueville, Northern traveler in the antebellum South, Frederick Law Olmsted, and prominent Southern writer Hinton Helper all pointed to striking differences between the North and the South, and attributed the deficiencies of the Southern region to the effects of slavery on the white population of the South. These differences between Northern and Southern whites were not merely perceptions or stereotypes, they were factually demonstrable in areas ranging from literacy rates to rates of unwed motherhood, as well as in attitudes toward work and violence. But attributing these differences to slavery ignored the fact that the ancestors of white Southerners differed in these same ways from the ancestors of white Northerners, when they both lived in different parts of Britain and when neither had ever seen a black slave. Does the moral enormity of slavery give it any more decisive causal weight in explaining the situation of blacks today than it did in explaining that of whites in the antebellum South? There is no a priori answer to that question, which must be examined empirically, like many other questions. The fact that so many black families today consist of women with fatherless children has been said by many to be a legacy of slavery. Yet most black children grew up in two-parent families, even under slavery itself, and for generations thereafter. As recently as 1960, 2/3 of black children were still living in two-parent families. A century ago, a slightly higher percentage of blacks were married than were whites. In some years, a slightly higher percentage of blacks were in the labor force than were whites. The reasons for changes for the worse in these and other patterns must be sought in our own times. Whatever the reasons for the disintegration of the black family, it escalated to the current disastrous level well over a century after the end of slavery, though less than a generation after a large expansion of the welfare state and its accompanying non-judgmental ideology. To say that slavery will not bear the full weight of responsibility for all subsequent social problems among black Americans is not to say that it had negligible consequences among either blacks or whites, or that its consequences ended when slavery itself ended. But this is only to say that answers to questions about either slavery or race must be sought in facts, not in assumptions or visions, and certainly not in attempts to reduce questions of causation to only those which provide moral melodramas and an opportunity for the intelligentsia to be on the side of the angels. Just as Western Europeans in post-Roman times benefited from the fact that their ancestors had been conquered by the Romans, with all the brutality and oppression that entailed, blacks in America today have a far higher standard of living than most Africans in Africa as a result of their ancestors being enslaved, with all the injustices and abuses that entailed. There is no question that both conquest and enslavement were traumatic experiences for those on whom they were inflicted, nor is either morally justified by whatever benefits might come of this to subsequent generations of their offspring. But history cannot be undone, nor does conceiving of races as intertemporal abstractions have any such track record as to make it look like a promising approach to the present or the future.
Like, I don't even really know what to say. I just lack words to say anything to you guys because it's just so insane. When I mean insane, it's just so insane. Blaming innocent dead people. People that are supposed to be died, that have died, and they are supposed to be resting in peace. You are blaming them innocently for your problems. Why is that? Why? Why are you blaming them for your problems? Guys, if you really want to know your roots, if you really want to know your roots, come to Africa. Come and ask them for reparation, especially Nigeria. Come and ask Nigeria. Because I know with the Nigerians, our history, we short. The blacks were the ones selling their people to other African people, to other white men. Oh, I don't really know. You guys don't really know what you have. Seriously. Go to African countries and see how some of them are suffering. Why do you think you have many immigrants coming to your side? It's because the system has failed them. And they're coming to your country to look for a greener pasture, and you are there. And that's why you see most of them, they'll come there and they make it. They make it. But you are there fighting for reparation. Reparation for what? Reparation for what? Why? Like, I don't even get it. Like, it's not even the color of your skin that people don't even like. It's your attitude, the way you behave, nothing more, nothing less. Seriously, nothing more, nothing less. Reparation this, reparation that. Mokuna rest. Seriously, you guys don't know what you're enjoying. You guys don't even know what you have. You don't really know when you have good system, everything is working good for you, you have good weather. Like, come to African countries and see. Come to African country. Or if the Americans say, oh yeah, move out from your country, go and find where you are from. Where do you want to start from? How will you feel? How will you feel? Hey, let me know your thoughts in the comment section. Let me know what you think about this. And I want to also applaud Mr. Thomas Sowell. As old as he is, he's 93 years old. But see the way he's talking. Like, I love the way he's talking. I love the way he still behaves as if he's a young guy. Because I know most of old people, they cannot even talk. Yeah. At that age, some of them, when talking, they'll be shaking. Like, they don't really talk so well. But Mr. Thomas Sowell, his wisdom, God. Like, he's really indeed a national treasure. Like, gosh. The way he makes people understand things is super P. Like, seriously, I really appreciate Thomas Sowell's wisdom and intellectuals. I really do. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section. Like, watch, and subscribe to my channel, and have a nice day ahead. Bye-bye.